today we're really excited to have with us one of our past Forrest Bassford Award winners. Those of you that know me, that competition is very dear to my heart, and having been chair of that for several years, and also being a past winner. But today, a past winner, a Kansas State University graduate, is going to be our speaker today. He transitioned from that typical ag comm job to now working for CattleFax, one of our beef industry's leading marketing analyst companies, or the elite one. And so today he's going to kind of share with us, and I love the title he came up with. You can just tell he's a communications person, but that lies, damn lies, and statistics, the art of writing with numbers. So Lance, we're so excited to have you with us, one of our own, and I'll let you kind of tell your story and help us learn how to better share numbers to our readers.
Cool. Well, thank you, Angie. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, can hear you great.
Perfect. Well, we'll just dig right in. Yes, the title is something that, I probably should blush as I sit there and say that. It's not normal for me to sit there and curse in the middle of a presentation, and probably lack some professionalism. But, second to the Bible, those of us in the Central Plains and Midwest, is probably Mark Twain. This is actually a quote that he repackaged in his own autobiography. It started out with him saying, "Hey, figures often beguile me, particularly when I have to arrange them myself." And I think that having grew up in ag communications in college and my first 5 years professionally, I can certainly lament the challenge that we all have. What's fascinating about that quote, lies, damned lies, and statistics, that Mark Twain quoted, he actually attributed that to this next gentleman, Benjamin Disraeli. He was a British prime minister in the late 1880s. But the funny thing is, nobody can actually find anywhere in printed word that he actually said this. And so I find it pretty fascinating. It's a quote that you'll hear thrown out there often, usually by politicians, because they equally can't understand statistics most of the time. But the quote itself is somewhat shrouded in some mystery. And I think that's kind of fascinating when you really think about it from a journalistic standpoint. But I think it also is something that we all struggle with. Even though I sit here today and I work in an agricultural communications setting, or no longer work in an agricultural communications setting, and I'm an analyst, you still have to think through numbers. That is not something that we're hardwired to think through, the complexities that a lot of times the numbers we're asked to work through and decipher and communicate back to our readers. That's not something that we can grapple with easily. And so I joked as I was trying to actually look for the origins of this quote in a little bit more detail back for a previous discussion I had with somebody one time. I did find this and thought maybe this could be, Angie, your next LPC Coffee and Collaboration topic. Quotes, damned quotes, and so you can keep using cuss words in titles as long as you can find existing references, I think, and be just fine. But you mentioned, Angie, my history. For those of you on the call, who is this guy and why should we care? This made me feel old all of a sudden, and I guess we're due for those every once in a while. I am one of 3 males that has ever won the Forrest Bassford Award. I did have hair once upon a time, but no longer. And it's kind of been a winding road since 2003 in Cleveland, Ohio, when I received the award. Started out working for Certified Angus Beef, was in their industry information team, working in producer communications, then transitioned to the marketing side of the company, putting on educational seminars and events for cattle producers. But I should have realized that outside of just communications, there was an inkling to do something even just a little different with that, because every year in college I'd come home and it seemed like I'd add another major or minor to my undergraduate degree. And so when I walked out of Kansas State with minors in animal science and ag economics and ag policy, it should have been a tip-off that maybe I wasn't done looking in other areas. So I came back to graduate school after 5 years full-time with Certified Angus Beef and got a master's degree in agricultural economics. I don't know if I would sit here today and say that I'm a great writer. I'm probably talking to folks that are far better writers than I could ever care to be. But the great thing is the sample that I'm compared to, it has raised the bar, I should say lowered the bar considerably. Just as much as ag communications folks tell me, hey, we struggle with numbers, I get a lot of numbers guys each and every week that tell me, hey, we struggle with words. And so I think it's very much a left brain, right brain functionality. And those of us that are a little more left brained, we can handle the words. Those of us that are a little bit more right brained, we can handle the numbers. And trying to find that happy medium is really what we're all trying to do. And I think through some of my thesis work in graduate school, and obviously my work here at Kansas or at CattleFax, has allowed me to understand a few things about trying to work with numbers and work with them well. Steve Souther, a number of you know him obviously from Certified Angus Beef and his time serving in various roles within LPC, was a huge mentor of mine. And I wouldn't be giving credit where credit's due if I didn't at least mention his work in helping me as a young writer also really helped me understand how do you write with numbers and communicate them to an audience in a way that they can take action. And so we only have 30 minutes today plus the time for questions. And so my goal today is really to hit you with 3 challenges that I see, give you some examples of how I've attacked those, and then allow us to have some additional questions and tangents off of that towards the end. So first, we're going to highlight those 3 challenges. I'm going to try to give you some insights that I've learned. And then at the very end, I want to give you a few resources. One of the great things with technology is, especially if you're in the livestock and even if you have to venture into grains, there's a lot of great online resources where you can access data. Because a lot of times if you're trying to cover a story for just a report, the report's only going to give you a limited sample set. It's only going to give you the frontmost data, whether that's the most current week or the most current month, usually the most current previous time unit, whether it's the previous week or the previous month, and then the year ago numbers. And a lot of times to bring light to a story, to bring light to numbers, you need more than that. So at the end, I'm going to highlight some resources that you guys can use to kind of put your analyst hat on as well. So one of the first examples that I want to give us, and it's going to give light to the first challenge I see regularly in writing with numbers, is an example I want to give you from the winter weather we had. And these are just a snapshot of 5 photos from around the country this winter. I don't think those of us in the livestock industry are lost on the challenges that we saw through Nebraska, most of the western corn belt, down all the way through Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas in dealing with some severe winter weather this year. You see photos like this, and it tugs at the heartstrings, right? We can lament with cattle in mud. We can lament with cattle producers trying to feed cattle in standing water, seeing cattle on an island, flooded out roads and bridges. And one of the biggest challenges that you're always going to have in writing with numbers is what you see is all there is. And there's a fascinating book that I wouldn't encourage you all to read. I have, and it put me to sleep at night. But I did put a link in this with the cliff notes at the bottom and really encourage you guys to access that and read those cliff notes. But this author actually won a Nobel Prize in economics, Daniel Kahneman, and he actually has a psychology degree. And his entire book talks about cognitive bias. And it is literally the idea of what you see is all there is. When you write with numbers, and oftentimes when you write any type of investigative or detailed story, you're fighting human nature, a human nature that leads even the best of us, the most intelligent of us, to make quick judgments based on the information we have available. And what I mean by that, to really put that into words, is your readers immediately have this reaction that, well, there's many details I don't know, but very rarely do they say, well, let me take the time to gather all the facts. In the information age that we live in today with social media, everything we see is surface level. We see those photos and we think automatically the worst. And what you saw when those floods hit was immediately we saw head counts of cattle losses in the millions of head. It was nothing to see in the first few weeks of that flood damage 700, 500,000. We even saw one news article that came out that estimated the Nebraska cattle losses at over 1 million head. We didn't publish any numbers at CattleFax on what we felt the numbers truly were, because we recognized how emotional of a situation it was. And we knew that if we tried to combat what we very well thought were false numbers and very inflated numbers, we were going to look like the bad guys. We wanted to allow the emotions of the situation to settle down and allow time for the good numbers to come out. And so why would we immediately look on the surface and say, well, there's no way there could be 500,000, 700,000 head or 1 million head losses? Well, challenge number one is numbers take work. If there's anything you can glean from that book I mentioned earlier from Dr. Kahneman, it's that laziness is built deep into our nature. And that's not a knock on any one of us. We're just as guilty of it at CattleFax too, and we have to recognize that every single day. Humans were trained to think fast to accomplish very routine tasks. We were hunters and gatherers. Thinking fast was hardwired into our survival mechanisms. But to think about numbers, you have to think slow, because oftentimes you have to manage a lot of complexities. And so when you think about numbers and the work that it takes, treat data and treat any type of numbers you see with a natural curiosity. That doesn't mean you discount them, but you sit back and you go, okay, 500,000 head of losses due to Nebraska floods, 700,000 head, million head. Does that make sense? Are the numbers you're hearing about lining up with what you know exists in those situations? And then lastly, generally the story is stronger than the statistics. Obviously, the photos we saw, the quotes we read, those are always going to carry more weight than the numbers. But you have to recognize that the numbers can support those key points or those sources, and you can leverage that explanatory power. And so let me dig into a little bit about why we looked at those Nebraska numbers and some of the first stories that were coming out, and we were very skeptical. There was very little dispute on the ground from others analyzing the situation that the biggest losses in that flood came from newborn calves. Most of Nebraska calves through the winter and early spring period. And so that tells us that let's look at the females in the beef cow herd, because Nebraska is primarily a beef cow state, and look at how many calves could they have had. Well, these are the January 1 numbers from the USDA for the state of Nebraska. And you'll see two numbers I have outlined in red. That's the number of beef cows that are expected to calve, 2 million head, roughly. And then the beef replacement heifers, which includes open heifers and bred heifers, roughly 350,000. Add those up, and there's about 2.6 million beef cows and bred heifers, because we have to assume that basically from the national numbers, about 70% of those are bred, 30% of those are open on January 1. So immediately we're sitting here saying 1 million head of losses when there's only 2.16 million beef cows and bred heifers in Nebraska already makes us a little skeptical. Again, most of these cattle in this number haven't calved on January 1, but they certainly would calve as we work into the year. So now this comes to the point where you have to sharpen your pencil. Again, intuitively, your readers aren't doing that. The USDA tells us that about 73% of calves are born from January to June in the first 6 months of the year. So let's just assume that we know a little bit more about Nebraska. More cattle in Nebraska are born in the winter than they are through the second half of the year, in the summer or fall. That's much more a thing that we see in the Southeast or the Midwest even. And so even if we make a conservative guess that 80% of Nebraska's calves are born in that January to June window, we also have to remember that even in a normal year, ranchers probably lose about 5% of their calves. Cow aborts. Winter weather is still a factor in an even normal year, but this was an extreme winter year. And knowing those baby calves were the concern and probably the bulk of those losses, let's assume that within that January to June calving window, that 3/4 of them were born on either side of that flood event, which occurred roughly around March 15th. So now we zero in on that. And we assume that what if the storm affected 20% of those newborns, 20% death loss? That's a pretty extreme number. Obviously, 4 times what would be normal, 20% versus 5%. Well, you work through the numbers and you take that 2.19 million I shared earlier, 80% of them calving in January to June, you get 1.7 million. They normally would lose about 90,000 calves out of that group. Well, if 75% of that earlier group calved February to April, that's 1.3 million calves on the ground. A 20% death loss within that sample is 182,000. So you take 182,000 plus 14,400, which is basically the 5% death loss you'd have in a normal year. And it says you lost basically 200 to 250,000 baby calves more than normal. It's a long ways off from the 500,000 to million head we heard earlier. This is across the entire state of Nebraska. Now let's look at a map of U.S. beef cow inventory. Where are the cows in Nebraska? In green, I highlighted the track of the Missouri River, which is where all the major flooding was. Not a lot of blue dots in Nebraska right along the track of the Missouri River. And so if you're going to sit back and say that the winter storm took 200,000 head or even more baby calves, plus their cows and some other animals along the way, you had to assume that it was more than just Nebraska, that it likely included winter death loss in the Dakotas and Kansas, and probably even Missouri and eastern Colorado as well. And so this goes to show that a lot of times you get caught up in the emotion, that all you see isn't always all you get. And then what's important for us at CattleFax is we also want to get to a point where we can make this number matter. And so what we do is we sit back and say, okay, so what does it mean? Even if the number is only 200 to 300,000 head across the entire cow-calf population. Well, the longer term effect is we know a cow doesn't get free rent, right? That once that cow loses its calf in the Central Plains, she's likely going to town because she doesn't have a calf on her side. Well, does that stunt our beef cow inventory growth? We think that's a long-term concern that we need to keep monitoring because March cow slaughter certainly was larger than expected. Short-term, one of the concerns immediately became, well, look at beef prices. They're going to skyrocket now because we don't have enough cattle. Well, those are baby calves. They're going to take at least 12 months to become beef in your retail store, but it could impact our 2020 fed slaughter forecast. And it could be much flatter than what we have forecasted in today, which is a 1.4% increase. And so you work through these things and it takes time. And that's a challenge that we all have to wrestle with, especially those of you in the journalism profession, because you're on a deadline and you're competing against immediately those social media posts of friends and ranchers and others in the countryside. And it becomes a balancing act. For us at CattleFax, we don't need to run into the immediacy of the event in a lot of our publications, but you guys do. And so that's one of the first challenges that I want to highlight that we struggle with every day, and I'm sure you do too. But oftentimes you need to put pencil to paper a little bit deeper to peel back the onion layers and see where the core of the issue resides from a true numbers perspective. The second example I want to give you of a challenge we see every day is relative to an example with U.S. protein production. I don't think it's lost on many of us in the livestock industry. We have a record high amount of beef, pork, and poultry being produced in the U.S. In fact, the record high was 2008 when I joined CattleFax in 2011. We went through a major drought for the next few years after that, and high corn prices and ethanol production making corn even higher. And we stunted growth in protein production for the first 5 or 6 years after that. But then 2015 hit with a new record high, and we've just built on that each and every year. And one of the things that I've learned when it comes to talking about statistics is making sure your message hits. And you guys have done an exceptional job of this over time. We've seen some great stories, some great work that many of you have done, all of you being LPC members. And this is a great book to read if you haven't. This is another book that I really encourage you to read. Unlike the other book, this is one you should purchase or buy on audible.com. Listen to it as an audio book, Made to Stick by the Heath brothers. And they have what they call their successful messages. And they have the list right there. They're simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional stories. That's what they figure is success. So it's simplicity, find the core idea. Unexpectedness, break the mental pattern of your readers. Concreteness, use a universal language that everyone speaks fluently. Steve Souther was one that always preached to me, make sure you run the reading statistics on your stories. There's a great tool in the Word program. You can sit there at the end of spell check, get your reading statistics, and if it was higher than an 8th grade level, he made you go back and rewrite it and simplify it. And I think that that speaks only more so when you have a lot of numbers in a story. Credibility. Create believability. Make sure you layer in statistics with experts, and make sure you challenge your experts to hold true to the statistics you have. Run your statistics before you bring your experts into the story and ask them about the numbers you found. Allow them to help you explain and tell that story behind the numbers. Emotion. Build connections that people care about. That's a little harder for us to do at CattleFax, but one of our core messages to all of our analysts in the office is build a story that gets our members' attention and creates action, or at the very least creates deep thought. And then stories. Develop a story that really creates action. And I think that's the core of building a story with numbers that really is going to stick. And so circling back around to this record high beef production and growing beef production that we're going to have over the next few years, one of the biggest taglines that I've seen everyone use, and this doesn't matter if it's ag media or trade associations, is I've seen the mountain of meat. And then I joke with folks, I'm surprised during Shark Week on the Discovery Channel, I haven't heard the Sharknado of meat. We've really painted a picture that this protein situation is doom and gloom. Whether it's the Arby's sandwich on the left or the avalanche of meat coming to destroy family farming operations. And that is the one thing that I would caution us of. Sometimes, even I'm guilty of it at CattleFax, I latch on to a headline or I latch on to a message in my lead sentence, and then I don't realize the consequences of it until after the fact. And I think that that's one thing that we all have to recognize is we've been in a situation where we have had record high beef production, pork production, and poultry production for now a handful of years. But yet we've never seen the avalanche. We've never seen the catastrophic event hit. And so even I was using this exact same language in some of my first presentations. And then I realized, well, wait a minute, that's not fully accurate. But this message has been so sticky that it still is around. When you look at our market prices, after the first correction out of 15 and 16, prices have been pretty flat. Really from 2017 into current year, prices have trended very sideways. This is retail prices here. It wouldn't look much different if I showed you wholesale prices or even cattle and livestock prices. And so when you sit back and think, and you rethink about the messaging of that sticky idea, it's one that I've sat back and said, well, actually, a stickier concept is the idea of a logjam. And I don't know if we have anybody from the Pacific Northwest on the phone today, but a log jam is relative to the Pacific Northwest timber industry, where they would literally harvest logs in the mountainous regions of the Pacific Northwest. And the best way they could get them to the paper and pulp mills and lumber mills downstream was to float them down the river. And these guys are actually called log drivers in this photo. And this is my cattle background coming to fruition. What they're holding are actual very long sticks that look similar to show sticks. And these crazy guys, unlike the cattle drives of the early and late 1800s, where they'd be on horseback driving cattle up and down the Central Plains, these guys didn't have horseback. They literally rode the logs right down the river. I don't know how to swim that well, and I certainly don't know if I'd have the balance to ride those logs. But if everything went well, they'd run into some obstacles here and there and use those sticks to free up the jams. But when things got dire, all of a sudden the logs start backing up behind them. They couldn't get the log jam freed. The only thing they had left to do was use dynamite. And so as I talk to producers about this record high amount of protein today, I've been trying to paint a different picture than I did early on. And I'd encourage us to think about, too, how those narratives change, because we've had record high production since 2015. And after the initial price correction, things have been pretty good. And they've been really good because of two things. We've had exceptional export demand of protein in the US, and we've had exceptional domestic demand for protein. If exports flinch, we're going to have a logjam. If we hit a recession and the US consumer pulls back their pocketbook a little bit, we're going to have a logjam. And then all of a sudden, maybe the only thing we can do to free up the logjam is use dynamite in our markets and blow up those prices to a significantly lower level to get the system moving that protein downstream again. And so it's a different narrative, but it paints a picture that, hey, it's not catastrophic today, but we got to keep things moving. And so again, very different, but again, how can you create sticky messages that work with your audience and paint a solid picture? Here's that in statistics, showing them, hey, look at what we've done from an export demand standpoint. This is how much beef, pork, and poultry is sent out of our marketplace in the US per US citizen. It was at a low in 15 at basically 36 pounds a person, but in 2019, will be at basically 43 pounds. 9 pounds more per person is going out of our marketplace. And you can see our forecast providing we don't have a recession or a big pullback in export demand. If we can continue on this trend, all of a sudden, consumption, not production, looks very reasonable. And if you look at this graph, this is total protein consumption in the US. For those of you in the livestock industry, I call this vegetarians eat your heart out. We're going to be in 2019 and into 20 likely consuming more red meat and poultry than we've ever consumed in the US before. And it's certainly going to grow from there, but not necessarily at catastrophic levels. And certainly today you could argue at 2017 to 2009, or sorry, 217 to 219 pounds a person, that's very similar to where we were prior to the recession. Again, it's not a mountain of meat, maybe it's just a log jam. So words can paint a very powerful picture in the minds of your audience in communicating numbers. Another challenge that we get, and the one that I'll leave you with last, is how do you talk about numbers in a very simple way? One of the most complex questions we get at CattleFax is, when will the herd expansion end? Very complex things go into understanding whether beef cow producers tend to keep more cows back or sell more cows in the herd. And it's a very pressing issue because everybody recognizes the cattle cycle. As prices peak, we tend to be at our lowest supplies in the cow herd. And when prices are at their worst or at their lowest, we typically have the most cattle around us. And those are typically in a 10-year cycle. So how do we quantify these complex issues quickly? And at CattleFax, as our lead market analyst, these are our 3 main publications. Our update articles that come out every Friday in our newsletter are sitting there, the 2 most windows to the left. If you're fortunate you're writing a front page article, you have 450 words and 1 graph to navigate a complex issue. If unfortunately your article didn't sift to the top of the most market relevant news, you get a middle or back page article. You get 250 words to communicate your issue with 1 graph. And then twice a year, we have our long-term outlook publication. If you're fortunate, you get a full page where you have 700 words and 3 graphs or 2 graphs and a table to communicate your issue. But more often than not, you're sitting there between 250 and 550 words with the goal of making sure your article as an analyst creates producer action and stimulates thought. You have to quantify a very complex issue quickly because anybody can write a long story well. It takes a lot of time to write a short story well, and that's not lost on any of you, I'm sure. And so as I think about it, let's go back to that herd expansion example. I wrote an article earlier this year and I said, guys, herd expansion and whether we expand or not can be distilled down into one very simple formula. Do we have green grass at cow-calf producer level? And do they have green cash? And if they do, you're going to create more calves. Everybody can recognize and rationalize on average, if they have green grass and green cash around them, in other words, if they have Mother Nature on their side and profitability, they're on average going to keep a few more cows around than the previous year. If they have one of those missing here or there, then we're not. And so you still have some things you have to consider: producer age, urban sprawl, the Midwest expanding corn acres, and a lot of other issues. But if I can distill it down to, across the US, do our major cow-calf areas have green grass and cash around them? People can wrap their head around that issue of, is the herd going to continue to expand or not? And this is one of the main reasons that CattleFax has been unique in saying we're approaching the herd being stable. But on average, we still expect a few more cows next year than the year prior. Because today in cow-calf country, Mother Nature's on their side and they're still more profitable than average. Another example that we've been working through is trying to help them understand, well, if I buy cows today, can I be profitable? Again, a very complex issue. And so what do we distill it down to? We just looked at, hey, what's the average calf price on a per head basis against the bred cow prices across the US on a per head basis? And we distilled it into a graph that simply said, what's the number of calves you need to pay for a bred cow? We're going to ignore feed cost. We're going to ignore labor rates. We're going to ignore what region of the country you're in. But we're just going to distill this down to a very simple metric. We recognize it's going to fall short of answering an individual producer's very specific question, but it paints a very quick picture of how expensive are these females today. And you can see, since the expansion started in 2014, we have not seen that ratio break down towards the long-term average. There is a lot of concern in our minds with how expensive these cow prices are today relative to the underlying calf market and what that means for the cow-calf segment going forward. Again, breaking down a very complicated issue into a bite-sized metric that producers can wrap their head around quickly. And then we can even take it to the producer level. Well, what do you think calves are going to be priced at over the next few years? Okay, well, if you think calves are going to be priced around $1.40, if you want to be buying a cow that's going to make you money, she needs to be at about 1.5 calves to pay for her. If your calf price over the next 2 years averages $1.40 a hundredweight, you shouldn't be paying more than $1,200 if you look in that middle column right inside the top part of the red box. Helps producers take a complex issue and spin it into a metric that makes sense for them without having to dig out their balance sheets and their break evens to figure out whether this is going to be helpful to them or not. And this even has relevance on more timely issues. African swine fever has been in the news a lot. This is a big deal. But anytime you talk about China, we get lost in numbers. China is a huge country, a huge demand source, also a very big player in the pork market. So how do you break this down? We have 5 or 4 bullet points there that we tried to use to break this down to our members. You can see on the left is a heat map of where hogs are most concentrated in China. If there's not an orange or red colored dot, it's usually a mountainous region when it comes to China. So very much concentrated on the easternmost portion of the country. But all of a sudden, if you start talking about China, instead of talking about millions and billions of pounds of production, and just say, hey, China represents 50% of all global pork production, you start to get the picture. If you say they're not only 50% of global pork production, but they also take 20% of all global pork imports across the US, or sorry, across the globe, you start understanding, wow, they not only produce a lot, they buy a lot across the globe. And then when you tell them, hey, they're 55% of the world's hog farm. Wow. Then you start understanding not only do they have a lot of production, but they have a lot of hog base. And then to dig in even deeper to understand what this industry looks like in China, over 40 million of those hog farms exist today. Lots of small operations when you really think about it. Millions upon millions of hogs, all being ran largely by small operations. So all of a sudden you start understanding what that Chinese industry looks like. And I'm not going to dig into all the math on the losses, but today, if you sit back and say China's going to lose 20% of their pork production, that's hard to grapple with. You can sit here and look at this graph and go, well, okay, I see that it was around 120 billion pounds last year, and this graph makes it look like it would be roughly 95 billion pounds then this year. So we're talking about a 25 billion pound shortage roughly, exactly 24 billion. Well, what does that mean? How do I put that into context? That's too complex for anybody to understand. Well, look at the second line in that box. 2019, the government estimates that total global pork exports will be 19.4 billion. If I tell you that their shortfall is 24 billion pounds, We can't supply that shortfall with all the exports that exist across the globe. That starts putting it in perspective. You want to add another layer to that? Oh, I missed the graph. US pork production alone this year is 27 billion pounds. All the pork produced in the US would fill that gap, and you'd have just a small, minuscule amount left over. That's when you start understanding the gravity of the situation, putting it into numbers and context that people understand. And those are some of the things we try to do with complex numbers at CattleFax every day. And so how can you find some of these numbers? How can you use these to benefit your audience and your customers? I wanted to put into your hands a few links, and I'm going to make sure I send Angie a PDF of this. I'm not sure if you have a means to share that somewhere, Angie, but I'll make sure you have it and it's available, that if anybody wants it, they can get it from you. The National Ag Statistics Service has a quick stats website. It's a little bit complicated to work through it, but I think once you play around with it, you can navigate it and get to the numbers you want. If it exists in a government historical report, it allows you to download it and turn it into an Excel document. If it's something price related, you can get that same data through the Ag Market News Service. If you go to that address, they actually have a news portal you can go to, and again, develop a spreadsheet so you can see that historical data. If it's cattle price or box beef or wholesale market related, it's under mandatory price reporting. And again, giving you a link that allows you to get right to the data. There's a new reporting service called MARS, Market Analysis Reporting Service. It's the 4th bullet point down. It's growing to include feeder cattle auctions across the country. So Oklahoma stockyards, winter livestock, a number of other major yards, the Joplin yards, all of their historical auction market data will be available into a database format where you can download it and see the numbers. Anything relative to production, consumption, supply, beef, pork, poultry is the livestock and meat domestic data link. And then anything international related specific to the US is the last one. And so these are some places where you can get flat files without much work and be able to see some of those historical trends on your own and not be subject to just the short-term view of a lot of the reports that you probably have to cover on a day-to-day basis. And so with that, I've probably taken more time than I should have. I'm going to leave you with this. Obviously, most of our audiences, probably many of you on the call, familiar with the Bible. I've been in this industry now, obviously grew up in it, but professionally bound to it since the early 2000s. One of the things I've noticed from the beginning is we're seeing more and more young people excited about production ag. Some of my first meetings I led at Certified Angus Beef to the ones that I help facilitate today at CattleFax, generational transfer is huge. I think there's generational transfer not only going on at our farms and ranches across the US, but I think it's also true of our industry. And so if my guess is correct, you're probably seeing a lot of generational transfer within the ag comm world as well. And so I think this is important, right from the gospel. One of the parables, listen carefully, unless a grain of wheat's buried in the ground, dead to the world, it's never more than a grain of wheat. But if it's buried, it sprouts and it reproduces itself many times over. One of the lessons I try to impart on my audiences when I give a presentation is don't allow your information, don't allow your tools, don't allow your skills to die with you. Don't let them retire with your retirement. Make sure you're passing those on. And I say that to cattle producers, to analysts, and I'll say it to you all as communicators. I've benefited so much from you all over the years. This is such a small thing that I can offer to provide some insight for you all. Do me the favor and continue that on in your own professions. And I think we'll all be better off for it. My email's there, my phone number's there, but do we have just a little bit of time for some questions, Angie, as well?
Yeah, sure. We do have some questions. If anybody has any, you can sure use the chat function and share them there, or you can unmute yourself and ask some questions too. Does anybody have any questions? Give people a few minutes here if they want to unmute and ask them. So Lance, maybe just for those on the call, if as journalists, if we want to use some of CattleFax's data or be able to quote you all, what are some of the steps to be able to, you know, reach out to you, or is there a process for ag communicators to get information for stories that you would suggest?
Yeah, absolutely. We do media interviews. I mean, I can't remember a time where we've turned down a media interview. If it's our own content and something that's a member-based article, we usually keep those pretty close to the vest, and obviously try to keep those in the hands of our members and not give those out, you know, in a news release form. But if somebody wants a quote for a story, I know many of the different LPC publications haven't been bashful about giving us a call. Most of those requests go to Kevin Good in our office, and usually if he's not around, I'm the second one to take those calls. So, you know, drop us an email, give us a phone call, and we'd be happy to, you know, talk about a report that comes out, share our perspective. If you're having trouble finding data or navigating that, helping in that way, it helps us to make sure that you get the story out, because it carries the message to a broader audience. We don't view ag communication professionals as a competition. We recognize them as a valuable mouthpiece for this industry. And so anything we can do to make your jobs easier, we're happy to help. Obviously, if you're badgering us every week or every month, we might tell you, hey, you know, it's time to let somebody else do this. But, you know, most of the time you're super respectful of that, and you want to vary your sources throughout a calendar year as well. But by all means, give us a call. And if you want a membership, our basic subscriber membership is $200 a year. It's pretty cheap, especially if you're sharing that among an entire staff. And it's very market heavy. And so that's certainly a possibility. We also just have a free online based subscription that you'll get a very trimmed down content set, but that exists out there as well on our website. You can just sign up for our free e-newsletter products as well. But again, it's a lot more watered down.
Anybody have any questions? Well, it's 10:45. Lance, we sure appreciate your insight. And I wrote lots of little notes down here as we went through it. You know, obviously you are such a great communicator, and we were so blessed to have you in the ag communications industry. And now how you've transitioned to CattleFax, you're helping us in the industry even more. So thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to share with our members. And for those of you online, we are taking a break in June and July. We won't have Coffee and Collaboration those 2 months. Be watching social media and the newsletter, and we'll let you know as we gear back up for this fall. But again, Lance, thank you for your time today. A shout out to Jakey, Kent Jakey and Rocking K Productions again for helping sponsor Coffee and Collaboration, and we appreciate Jakey and his sponsorship as well. So everybody have a great summer. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back in touch in August.